testimony is, but Jesus caught you. Right? So in verse 31, I think that was, it says, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me, this is verse 28, to come to you on the water. So he said, come. And Peter had come down off the boat. He walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately, verse 31, this was the main passage last week. This is what matters. This is what I wanted you guys to go home with this point. And immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And last week, the emphasis on the message that I wanted you guys to walk home with or go home with was, Jesus will catch you. Yeah. And not only will Jesus catch you, but some of your stories, your testimonies are, Jesus caught me. Yeah. Right? And perhaps that the story and the message of our lives is not so much about us as much as it is about the power of who Christ is. And the truth of who Christ is in our lives. And so when I went home and I was praying and I was trying to figure out, God, what is it that you want me to preach about tonight? What is it that you have for me to say tonight? And he took me back to that passage, but he focused more in on verse 33. But I want to back up a little bit. I want to back up about the story of Peter, because the story of Peter, I believe, is a story that speaks about a greater context, a greater reality in our lives, right? I honestly think that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, is that he is our hope. That honestly, the ultimate message of the cross is demonstrated in the story of Peter. That is, in our broken state, in our utter humanity, Jesus steps in and catches us. Not just in our circumstances, that's the gospel. That if you think about the story of Adam and Eve, if you think about when Adam and Eve sinned and they failed, that caused a separation between us and God. That caused an inability for us to fellowship with a perfect God, with a holy God, with a righteous God. Our sin caused that separation. And Jesus decides, I'm going to step in and do something about that. Right? And ultimately the message of the gospel is Jesus catches us. He steps in and he lays down his life so that you and I can have eternal fellowship with him. So you and I can have an eternal relationship with him. So it's not just about how good I am, how righteous I am, how perfect my faith is, how strong I am. But the gospel is more about Jesus than it is about me. But somehow in our modern Christianity, we've made the gospel about our righteousness. Somewhere in our modern Christianity, we've made it about our works and our ability to please God and our ability to be strong and our ability to resist temptation. And all of those things are good, but they're broken and they're misconstrued if we don't understand that at the foundation, that all that we are and all that we will ever be is a reflection of the fact that Jesus caught us. Are you guys following me? Yes. I should follow my notes. I said we make the gospel about us and what we can do. But something is wrong with this picture. And something's wrong with the picture of the gospel if we make it about our actions, right? Because there's this one man who's dying on the cross next to Jesus, right? And Jesus is on his way to death. And in those times, Roman crucifixion was one of like the worst types. It's only for the worst of criminals, right? Or if you don't know, so Roman crucifixion was for the worst criminals. So if you were on a cross, that means you did some stuff. So they put Jesus up on the cross with the worst criminals out there. And yet he's the only one up there who is not guilty, right? And Jesus is on his way out of here. They're about to kill him, and the homies next to him, they're about to be on their way out too, right? They're about to die. And one man looks to Jesus and says, remember me. Yeah. Yeah. If the gospel was about what we can do, that man would have been counted out. Because physically, there was nothing he could do. Are you guys following me? Yeah. He literally was one of the worst criminals in that time. And he was up on the cross rightfully. And on his way out of here, like to his deathbed, to the grave, hung just out of here, right? And the most he could do in that moment was acknowledge who Jesus was. And his simple but powerful acknowledgement of who Jesus was is what got him eternity with Christ. Is what granted him access to the kingdom. And so if our position in Christ, if who we are in this world is anything about who we are, he was counted out. Because he could literally do nothing. There was no work that he could do that would make him right before God. The most that man could do was acknowledge who Jesus was. And his acknowledgement of who Jesus was is what got him eternity. Is what got him access into heaven. What got him access into heaven. Which made me really think, the gospel is not about me and you. The gospel is about the power and the work of Jesus. Not about man. When did the gospel become about us? At its best, it is about us only to the degree that we're the recipients. And then we become the vehicle by which God makes himself known to the world. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 14, verse 33. So Peter has this encounter with Jesus, right? He has this experience, and I pointed to this verse last week. Peter has this encounter with Jesus. He has this experience. But the story doesn't stop at Peter having his moment with Jesus. The story doesn't stop at Jesus catching Peter. The next part of the verse goes to Matthew 14, verses 33. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." These men witnessed what God had done in Peter's life. And as a result of what God had done in Peter's life, they fell to their face and worshiped God. They didn't stand back and say, "Oh man, Peter, you're tight, man. You got that dope relationship with God. He caught you. You was falling in the ocean. You was thinking you're so amazing. You must be Jesus' best friend." That wasn't their response. Their response had nothing to do with Peter. Amen. Their entire response to what God did in Peter's life was they fell to their face and they worshiped God. And for the sake of the CD, if I were to title this message anything tonight, it would be "For Your Glory." That the message of Peter's story wasn't about Peter. It was about the glory of God made manifest through Peter to such a degree that someone else was able to look into Peter's life, Peter's situation, Peter's circumstance, and see the power of God made manifest through Peter. Not because of Peter, but because of who Christ was in Peter's life. And it made me think, like, if I were, when I die, when I leave this earth, I really, I made a conclusion that God, this is the testimony that I once said about my life. And that I believe that God has called each of us as believers, is that I knew God and that I made God known. That is what this story is about. That Peter himself, needed to experience what he experienced with Jesus. Because I told you guys last week, right before Peter went into his boat situation with Jesus, Peter had just witnessed Jesus do a miracle, right? Peter had just saw Jesus feed all these people with, I don't know the number, a couple loaves of bread and some fish. I think it was fish. Yes. The point is Jesus performed a miracle. So Peter had witnessed Jesus perform a miracle. And right after he witnesses Jesus perform a miracle, he's in a situation and he gets afraid. But you would think he just saw Jesus witness a miracle. No, he witnessed Jesus do a miracle. So you would think that his witnessing of Jesus' miracle would have been enough to sustain his faith in the midst of his storm, right? But no, Peter gets afraid, like us. And I came to the conclusion that there's a difference between knowing God, right, and knowing God. And so there's that knowing of God that's like, I saw God do that miracle. I know God can do miracles, right? Then there's that knowing of God that's like, God, I need a miracle. And there's something about the miraculous hand of God, or something about a knowing of God that only comes from experience. So Peter had to experience God for himself. in the middle of his storm, in the middle of the ocean, while he is sinking, Jesus caught him, and that became an experience for Peter that could allow Peter, enable Peter, empower Peter to say, I know Jesus can work miracles. It's one thing to know Jesus can work miracles, but Peter said, if I know Jesus to work miracles, because I was on my way down, and Jesus caught me, right? And so his life gets to now be able to say, I know him. I know him for myself. I've experienced him for myself, right? And so the testimony is able to say, I know God. I know God, but I know God. And I'm sure some of you guys have had those experiences. And it's like the Bible talks about going from glory to glory. And we're being perfected in the faith. And we're continuously being made into the image of Christ. And God is continually molding us, right? So it's not this point in life where you're like, I know God. Like, I'm not saying like you get to a point where you've arrived and you have this ultimate knowledge of God. I'm saying there's an intimate knowing of God that comes from journeying this life with God, right? And allowing God to literally partner with you and literally do life with you to such a degree where you're like, I know God. It's like, it's a much better version of like your BFF, right? It's like, you know your friend. They can pick up the phone and you can hear their voice and not even them, they don't even have to say who they are. You just know because you know their voice. You know their presence. You know their personality. Like they've journeyed so much of life with you that you're just like, you know them. It's like that with God, but even better, right? And it's not so much about us, but it's that God keeps putting us in situations where we get to know him a little better. And those situations are not always fun situations. Those situations are not always desirable situations. Half those situations, like, Jesus, I would have liked if you did that a little bit differently. You know, like you get into those moments where God's like, is this how I had to learn? Like, are you sure there was no other way you could have let me know you? You know, but sometimes you go through stuff like Peter, right? Where you get to know God. And then we get to verse 33, where it transitions from it just being about Peter knowing God to Peter's life being an opportunity to make God known to others.